What if I told you that the lifeblood of our entire modern world, the very energy that powers everything from our cars to our industries, was just suddenly turned off? Well, that's not some sci-fi plot. It's exactly what went down in 1973. Today, we're diving into the oil crisis, a wild story about power, politics, and the day the world literally ran on empty. And look, this isn't just a dusty old history lesson. This was a shockwave that rippled across the entire globe. A crisis that didn't just cause a few headaches. No, it completely reshaped economies. It twisted geopolitics, and it fundamentally changed how we think about energy. And you know what? We're still feeling those ripples today. To really get what this felt like, we have to start where most people felt it first, their local gas station. Because when the oil stopped flowing, what followed was just immediate, pure chaos right on the streets. I mean, just stop and think about that for a second. Your normal, everyday errand of filling up the car suddenly became so tense, so desperate, that people felt they needed to carry guns. This wasn't just some economic report on the news. This was a total breakdown of social order, where a basic need could spiral into a dangerous confrontation. And here's the number that hit every single household budget like a sledgehammer. In just 1 month, November 1973, the average price of gasoline shot up by 40%. Can you imagine? This was a shock like nobody had ever seen, sending inflation through the roof and putting a massive, painful strain on families everywhere. So this new reality was just weird. Life was suddenly governed by these bizarre new rules. You could only buy gas on certain days depending on whether your license plate ended in an odd or even number. The government dropped the national speed limit to 55 miles per hour just to save fuel. It wasn't a slow shift. It felt like the world had changed completely, almost overnight. Okay, so how on earth did this happen? What caused this global meltdown? Well, this wasn't a natural disaster, and it wasn't just a random market crash. No, this was a deliberate political act, a decision that turned the world's most vital resource into a weapon. And the dominoes fell fast. It all started with the Yom Kippur War. When the U.S. started airlifting weapons to support Israel, Arab oil-producing nations, well, they retaliated with a small production cut. But when the U.S. doubled down with an even bigger aid package, they unleashed the oil weapon in full force. A complete embargo. No more oil for the United States or its allies. Period. And here's where things got out of control. The stated goal was surgical, right? Punish a few specific countries. But the reality? It was like a global economic virus. It threw the entire industrialized world into a tailspin of something called stagflation. Basically, when oil gets crazy expensive, everything costs more to make and ship, so you get inflation. But at the same time, businesses get squeezed and stop hiring, so you get stagnation. It's the worst of both worlds, and it created huge rifts between allies who were all scrambling for a drop of oil. Now, it's really easy to point the finger at the embargo as the only cause, but the truth is, the world was already a house of cards just waiting to fall. The crisis didn't create the problem, it just brutally exposed a massive dependency that had been building up for decades. And the group holding all the cards was OPEC. They formed way back in 1960. And by 73, this cartel of oil-producing nations controlled a huge chunk of the world's oil. That gave them an insane amount of power to mess with the global market, a power they were now ready and willing to use. And here was America's biggest weakness. The post-war boom was fueled by cheap energy, and U.S. oil consumption was just skyrocketing. But at the same time, its own domestic production had peaked and was actually starting to go down. So you have the U.S., with just 6% of the world's population consuming a third of its oil. That created this giant, dangerous gap that could only be filled with imported oil. But hey, the U.S. wasn't the only one in a tough spot. Its key allies were in even deeper trouble. By 1973, Western Europe was relying on imports for over half its energy, and Japan, a staggering 70%. Their economies were completely at the mercy of the very oil that was now being cut off. So, what happens when a world so completely addicted to cheap, endless oil suddenly has the tap turned off? The consequences weren't just long lines and high prices. They were permanent. They were transformative. The shock of 1973, well, it forced a painful but really necessary reckoning. It was the end of an era, and it forced governments, industries, and just everyday people to completely rethink their entire relationship with energy. And here's what kicked it all off. Before the embargo, a barrel of oil cost about $3.
By the time the embargo was lifted, it was $12. That's a nearly 300% price hike in just a few months. That single price shock is what drove the economic pain for the rest of the decade.
But you know what? Out of that pain came some pretty profound changes. To make sure this never happened again, governments created strategic oil reserves. The age of the giant American gas guzzler started to die out, replaced by smaller, fuel-efficient cars from Japan and Germany. For the first time, energy conservation became a household idea. And really crucially, this was the moment that sparked the first real serious investment in alternative energy. So when you boil it all down, 1973 wasn't just a crisis, it was a major turning point in history. It was the end of the long summer, that whole post-war era of what felt like limitless growth, all powered by cheap, easy oil. The world learned a very hard lesson. Energy is not infinite, and it is definitely not guaranteed. Which really brings us to our final thought here. The crisis of the 1970s was a brutal, unforgettable lesson about the dangers of relying too much on a single source of energy. So as we face our own energy challenges today, the question we have to ask ourselves is, have we really, truly learned that lesson?